On a remote rocky island a few miles off the Channel coast stands the Fang Rock lighthouse. There have always been tales of the beast of Fang Rock, but when the TARDIS lands here with Leela and the Doctor, the force they must deal with is more sinister and deadly than the mythical beasts of the past. It is the early 1900s. Electricity is just coming into common usage, and the formless gelatinous mass from the future must use the lighthouse generators to recharge its system. Nothing can stop this Rutan scout in its search and its experimentation on humans. Doctor Who and the Horror of Fang Rock is a book I've wanted to review for several months. At the time I even had a clever clickbait title in mind for it, one which would have likely played well to YouTube's fickle algorithm. Of course, this was back in the days before I'd committed the channel to an aesthetic of only the most blandly presentational video titles. Nonetheless, with the Cthulhu Christmas booktube event a recent memory, I thought it was a good opportunity to dust off my copy of the book in question and share a few words on one of the most atmospheric and terrifying adventures in the history of Doctor Who. Written by longtime Doctor Who screenwriter and story editor Terrance Dicks, The Horror of Fang Rock is a novelization of a 4-part serial from the show's 15th season. The episodes, also written by Dicks, were broadcast in September 1977, with the novelization following in March 1978. Fang Rock is one of several classic Doctor Who stories throughout the show's long-running history that draws heavily on the influences of horror and darker science fiction, with the Doctor and his companion Leela finding themselves among a small group of survivors trapped in an isolated lighthouse. As the characters attempt to grapple with the extreme conditions and circumstances of the situation, they find themselves stalked and menaced by a shape-shifting, interdimensional creature, one that soon threatens the survival of humanity itself. Already, similarities to John Carpenter's classic 1982 horror film The Thing are evident. In Carpenter's film, it was an Antarctic research facility that became host to a shape-shifting cosmic terror, whereas here it's a lighthouse in the early 1900s. However, both stories mine dread and suspense from the isolated, claustrophobic nature of the setting, and from the pressure cooker-like atmosphere that builds and develops between the different characters as they begin to unravel into frantic states of fear and self-preservation. Like The Thing, there is also a similar transposition of science fiction elements onto what is essentially a slasher movie narrative, with the initial band of characters often separating into smaller groups or wandering off to explore the darker, isolated spaces of the location, while in the background of the story, the unseen terror stalks our protagonists from the shadows. This is something that is also consistent with another classic science fiction horror film of the same period, Alien by Ridley Scott. Of course, to talk about The Thing, we need to first talk about The Thing from Another World, the influential 1951 science fiction film produced by Howard Hawks and directed by Christian Nyby, as well as the film's source material, the 1938 novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. And to talk about Campbell's story, we likely must first talk about the influence of H.P. Lovecraft's 1931 novella, At the Mountains of Madness. Campbell's story feels heavily indebted to the influence of At the Mountains of Madness. Both stories share similar plots, themes, and settings. It's almost as if Campbell is mimicking elements of Lovecraft, in much the same way that the cosmic terror of the Thing itself mimics the genetic form of its human hosts. If all roads lead to Rome, as the proverb states, then all cosmic horror inevitably leads us to Lovecraft. And the same is true for the Horror of Fang Rock. Even the title feels indebted to Lovecraft, reminding us of the titles of stories like The Horror at Red Hook, The Horror in the Museum, and The Horror at Martin's Beach, the latter written in collaboration with Sonia H. Greene. The coastal setting, with its rugged shoreline, fog-enshrouded lighthouse, and creeping protoplasmic threat, are each rich in Lovecraftian iconography and lore, and I'll admit a big part of the appeal of Fang Rock for me was in seeing such an iconic character, the great Time Lord Doctor Who, transported into this kind of neo-Gothic cosmic horror landscape. Having not seen the initial episodes of Fang Rock prior to reading the novelization, I was better able to let the story play out in my imagination. The atmosphere of the story and the authenticity of the scenes depicting the workings of the lighthouse and its crew are well defined. Likewise, the relationships between the different characters, each with their own objectives, fears and concerns, each representing different facets of social class, politics and education, are keenly observed and add weight and depth to the unfolding story. Some characters engender sympathy, while others are set up like pantomime villains, there to be brought down a peg or worse by the rampage of this roving mutant sentry. The book perfectly captures that feeling of storm-bound claustrophobia and isolation, as well as that suspended sense of characters forced to wait out the clock as the existential threat of something menacing and indecipherable draws ever near. As Doctor Who books go, The Horror of Fang Rock is a brisk, engaging, atmospheric read. It isn't great literature, nor does it strive to be, but it does explore themes like humanity's capacity for self-destruction, the changing attitudes of the then nascent 20th century, and even class exploitation. All interesting themes that enrich the book's slow-burning terror. The writing of Terrance Dicks isn't verbose or overly complicated. It's not punctuated by the heady purple prose that defines the works of Lovecraft and his disciples, but it is precise in its storytelling, and the book is a generally easy read for an intended audience of younger readers. As a novelization, the structure of the story and the way it's told is clearly shaped, even dictated sometimes by the format of the initial shooting script. The chapters are made up of short, terse, back-and-forth scenes that create narrative through a kind of montage or mosaic. Here the author uses a technique which in filmmaking terms we'd call cross-cutting, switching back and forth between a succession of short individual scenes in a way that builds tension and suspense, while also creating the impression of interactions between characters occurring simultaneously, often in real time. The writing as such can feel stripped back and presentational, as if Dicks is merely relating a description of the events, rather than exploring it from a deeper psychological perspective. However, as a book intended for a younger audience, this simplicity of prose and storytelling didn't bother me. The general hook of the story and the novelty of seeing the Doctor locked in a battle of wits with one of his most devious and dangerous foes was more than enough to keep me entertained during the book's slim 126 pages. In bringing the world of Doctor Who colliding with the Lovecraftian world of cosmic horror, the book and its series likely provided a gateway for a lot of younger Doctor Who fans first encountering the genres of horror and darker science fiction. And I think this alone, independent of the book's great atmosphere and its story of survival, is reason enough to give The Horror of Fang Rock some small legacy of influence. If you've watched this far, then I want to say a hearty thank you for spending your time with me today. If you're a fan of The Horror of Fang Rock, then I'd love to know your thoughts on the book, as well as its television counterpart, in the comments below. Likewise, if you have a favourite Doctor Who book, either from this particular series of Target books from the 1970s and 1980s, or from one of the more recent BBC editions, then please feel free to share your recommendations below. Once again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're staying safe, keeping well, and I'll see you in the next episode.